before we go on, is there any volunteers that want to try and hit that note real quick? Anyone? Anyone? Let's move on. There's that phrase, we're creatures of habit, and I don't know about you, if you have certain routines that you have that are a part of your day or how you do certain things. I have my own routines that I kind of go through in different circumstances and different situations. Last night, I learned that routines sometimes are known by the people around us. I didn't realize that my friends know some of my routines. And I was at dinner last night, my wife and I with some friends of ours. We were over at Casa Orozco, and it just happened that I was at the end of the table with other dads. We were talking about things, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the conversation, one of my friends turns to me and says, "Hey, what are you doing here? It's Saturday night. You don't go out with us on Saturday night." And I thought to myself, he's right. I don't go out on Saturday night because I'm usually trying to get ready for Sunday. And I go, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "Why are you here? Are you like trying to find things to preach on?" So evidently I am, because here I am telling the story, right? And so we were laughing about that. And so as we were chatting about it, then all of a sudden he goes, "Well, what are you talking about tomorrow in church?" And I go, "Well, actually, I'm talking, I could preach right now if you want me to." And none of them wanted me to preach at Casa Orozco. I thought it was going to be good. We started with an offering. But I said, "I'm actually preaching on non-circumstantial joy." And he kind of looked at me, and they were kind of all looking at me, and they went, "That sounds like it's really important. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it sounds important." And I was thinking to myself, it's really important. It really actually is important. As we try to understand what it means to experience this gift of life, we open ourselves to who God is, who God has made us to be, and what we're called to be about, non-circumstantial joy is sort of foundational to our understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And it's at the core of this theme that we're looking at throughout the month of November, which is this sermon series that we're calling All of It. And sort of the premise of it, the sort of affirmation of the series is that if life is a gift, then all of it is a gift, right? And we're sort of acknowledging that so oftentimes we are led to believe that we only are grateful for some things, the things that we like or the things that we prefer, the things that we can control. But we're reminding ourselves in this series that if in fact life's a gift, and if in fact God's in all of it, then we want to remind ourselves that means God's a part of the circumstances and the situations, all of those circumstances and situations that we're experiencing. We're trying to not be so superficial in the things that matter to God and in our faith that we believe that God's only in those things that we would choose or that we prefer or those perspectives that we have, that ultimately God's got to be bigger than that. And so we're opening ourselves to what it looks like to see how there can be blessings found, God's presence demonstrated in the midst of hard times or unwanted circumstances or situations that we didn't ask for or don't want. And we started last week by talking about on All Saints' Day, just even as we acknowledge the sadness of people who have died in our lives, we talked about the grateful tears that we shed, because just as there is sadness there is gratitude for their presence in our lives, that both of those things can be true. And so this morning we're continuing to open ourselves to how that can be true. And before we get to the passage that we'll read here in just a second, we're going to look at John chapter 15. So if you have a Bible with you, if you have an app on your phone, or we're going to be looking in just a second in John chapter 15. But one of the things I love about this passage, and some of you already know this, is that who was the first person to walk on the moon? Neil Armstrong. Who was the second person to walk on the moon? Buzz Aldrin. Who said Buzz Aldrin? Right? And while that might be true, Buzz Aldrin is the first person to have done something on the moon, and that is celebrate and serve communion. Did you know this? Yeah, some of you did, some of you didn't. So Buzz Aldrin, who was a Presbyterian elder, by the way, had his own personal home communion kit that he brought with him on that journey to the moon. And it wasn't broadcast because evidently at the time there was an atheist activist, Madeline somebody, I don't know who she was. I was a month old when this happened. So NASA didn't broadcast it because they were afraid they would get sued. But Buzz Aldrin and the crew celebrated communion there on the moon, and Buzz Aldrin led it. And in leading it, he read from Scripture, and he read John 15. Some of you know this. Some of you are nodding your heads. I appreciate that. Google it. Really? I got you on this one. And what was great about it was that when asked later about this whole experience, what Buzz Aldrin said was he picked John 15 because as he was thinking about human curiosity and discovering the universe and the scientific pursuit of understanding, he wanted to connect it to this idea of God's love that we experience in Jesus, that we're going to see here in just a bit as we read from John chapter 15, that he wanted us to understand how the scientific pursuit flows out of our connection to Jesus. So, we're going to look at that passage from which Buzz Aldrin quoted on the moon. John chapter 15, verses 1 through 12. And so if you're reading along, if you just want to listen, whichever it is, let's hear what God has to say to us in this passage. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. And you have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, and this was the part that Buzz Aldrin quoted, apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I've said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. And this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. You probably noted, some of you are probably keeping track, that ultimately in this passage we're told to abide in Jesus and abide in my love 11 times, right? Abide is this word that means to stay connected, to remain with, to stay with. And so Jesus is talking about a connectedness that's centered in the truth of God's love that's demonstrated in his life, right? And that's what we're told to remain in, to stay connected to stay connected with. And as we look at this image, right, he gives this agricultural metaphor and image that at the time would have certainly been understandable and relatable. I actually think that we have this unique ability here in the valley to understand it as well, right? We drive through these vineyards all the time, and so we can almost imagine exactly what this is saying, that Jesus is speaking about branches and how those branches thrive. And he speaks about pruning and the necessity at times for pruning. He speaks about when branches are pruned or when they wither away, that you dispose of them. Parenthetically, this verse here, that when I was in high school, I was told the whole verse, what is it here, 6, that a branch withers, such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. It has nothing to do with judgment. That's not about hell or any of those things. It's talking about the agricultural reality that when you prune branches, you then dispose of them, and the way they dispose of them was to burn them. Right? So he's trying to speak about this image of what is the cyclical way in which branches thrive and fruit comes to fruition, how harvests work. And so what he's saying in the midst of all of this is that there is this cycle that we see in the vine and the branches But what he talks about there at the end is what I think is the key to understanding and embracing non-circumstantial joy. In verse 11, when he says, I say all these things, this sort of cycle of pruning and burning and bearing fruit and all of that, maintaining this connection to the vine through it all, he says, I tell you all of those things so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. That ultimately, spiritual joy is found in maintaining a connection to the vine. That Jesus is talking about. What I think that we're invited to consider this morning is that in a world that so oftentimes says that happiness is found in something, as soon as you get something, as soon as you experience something, as soon as you have something or are with something or whatever those things are, in a world that says those circumstances dictate your happiness, Jesus is reminding them, and I think Jesus is reminding us, that there is a joy that transcends circumstance. That there's a joy that's found in maintaining a connection with the vine that is the reminder of God's love for each and every one of us. A love that is not predicated on what you've done or what you've not done, right? It's not this conditional love. We baptize children, we baptize adults, reminding ourselves that God's love isn't transactional. It's not something that I get to say you do or don't have. It's not something a church gets to tell you is or isn't yours. But ultimately, God's love is that which sustains us in the midst of all of these circumstances that we find ourselves navigating. And my sense is that you all are here because you're navigating a wide variety of circumstances. Life tends to provide us with a wide variety of circumstances to navigate. And so this morning, I just want to ask you to spend some time. I think it was either Plato or Socrates that says, the unexamined life is the life not worth living. I want you to examine your life. What are the things that have been most formative in making you who you are? What are the events or the situations that have been most instrumental in you being you? And as you think about those things, one of the things that I know, and I've talked about this before, is that many of us, when we think of the 1 to 5 things that have made us who we are, what studies will say, what our experiences say, is that many of us, if not all of us, there's something there that is adversity or disappointment or challenge. On all of our lists, at least one thing is probably something that we didn't want or didn't ask for at the time. And I've answered this question before, last week I kind of spoke about it, but again, I'm just going to remind us that if you were to ask me the thing that has made me most me, the thing for which I am most grateful and blessed by, I would say it was my mom and my mom's disease. And many of you know that my mom, before I was born, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She was told not to have any more kids. The world needed her to have at least one more kid. And she did. And at 9 years old, I started taking care of her because she gradually was not able to walk, wasn't able to do a lot of things for herself. And at 9, I became her caregiver. And at 11, I watched my mom no longer be able to walk on her own, and she went into a wheelchair. And the greatest blessing in my life was that relationship I had with my mom. My mom lived out this joy in unbelievable ways. And I learned from her. I learned how to relate to things. I learned how to love because of her. Absolutely the thing for which I am most grateful. And if you ask me the thing that has been the greatest hardship in my life, I won't even let you finish the sentence, and I will tell you it was my mom's disease. And it was at 9 years old having to take care of my mom. And it was at 11 years old watching her no longer be able to walk. And it was doing things that I don't even want to go into that I did for my mom as a teenager. And the absolute greatest blessing in my life is the absolute greatest hardship in my life. And in the midst of all of it, I experienced non-circumstantial joy because of God's relentless love for me, God's forgiveness and grace at work in my life, through my life. That's our invitation this morning. And I've been reading these devotionals, and if you haven't gotten a copy of this devotional that we have for the month of November, go to the church's website. You can download it. The stories that you all are sharing about the things for which you're grateful, that that so oftentimes emerge out of challenging situations, unwanted circumstances. That's what we want to be as a church community, not this superficial place that thinks that God is somehow wanting us to always get what we want. That's just not life. And if we gather here and think that that's what we want to be fed by, then we are like feasting on cotton candy. It might look like it's filling, but there's nothing there. Non-circumstantial joy is filling. Now, it's frustrating because it means that things aren't always what we want and we don't always understand things. But it's faithful and it fulfills us in the midst of this life that is a gift. And we get to gather and remind ourselves that in that gift, God is a part of all of it. God is a part of the things that we celebrate and that we're excited about. God is a part of the things that have broken our hearts and we want to end so badly. God is a part of the things that we don't understand and that frustrate or disappoint us. God's a part of all of that and is inviting us to stay connected so that we might be reminded again about the joy that is found in God's presence, God's grace, God's love in the midst of all of it. And this morning we're invited to remind ourselves of that yet again, to be renewed by that truth again, and to be anchored to a love that is revealed and experienced in our lives for sure, but also through our lives when we allow it to be. Amen.